The Winnipeg Jets have made their first round selection at this year's draft. Sascha Boumedienne, welcome to Winnipeg.
Your Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, we are kicking off with the Jets' first-round draft pick, Sascha Boumedienne. Very interesting guy. I don't think a lot of people expected Winnipeg to take him based on who was still available in this first round. Quite a few guys slipped a little bit further, but Bumemedian might be one of the closest picks in vibes and sort of potential trajectory to Dylan Samberg that we've had really since Samberg was taken. So lots of intrigue there. We'll talk a little bit about him. I also want to talk about the draft so far, some of the big trades, whether it's really lived up to the hype in terms of the craziness, or if the nothing ever happens crowd has once again won out. And then finally, I also want to update some of the thoughts on some of the contract extensions we're seeing, what the continued market looks like with Ehlers still out there, and what the Jets are probably going to look for as we head into day 2 of the draft. But before we do, did want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Now, tonight, obviously, the Jets went in with their first round pick, and they had a couple of options, right? The first round this year was super strange. I think a lot of teams didn't really have the best read on this class once they got to pick 12, 13, 14. You start getting past the top 10 and even a little bit inside the top 10. It wasn't really clear how this order was going to work. Obviously, Schaefer went first, but then you had Misa, Frondel, Desnoyers, Martin, and then Martone and Hagens, which is probably not quite how people thought this was going to go. I thought Hagens would be a little bit higher, but apparently he slipped to 7th. So, yeah, the first round this year, very interesting. And then you saw guys like Carter Bear kind of slip towards the middle of the round. Eklund going to the Islanders. It was a very interesting couple of picks. And then the Jets had a chance, maybe at a guy like Bill Zanon, but they didn't end up making it that far. He ended up going to the Pittsburgh Penguins. And so as the board kind of kept thinning out, the Jets suddenly found themselves with a couple of choices, but not a ton that I think was immediately apparent as, Winnipeg's maybe number 1 selection. But Sascha Boumedienne does kind of fit how the Jets have maybe liked to draft some of their defenders. You're looking at a 6'1", 6'2", very smooth skating, young Swedish D who actually just started his very first college season at Boston University. And what is very interesting about Sasha, a couple of things, right? The first to know is that he is the youngest player in college hockey. The second thing is that his first half of his BU season was not good. But then as he started to get more and more comfortable playing against guys who were significantly older than he was, he actually started to earn more and more trust from the coaching staff to the point where he was playing, 24, 26 minutes alongside Tom Willander. So very clearly, he earned a lot of trust. The offense very much did start to pick up towards the end of the season. 13 points in 40 games for a 17 or 18-year-old in college is pretty darn impressive when you think about the role that he's playing. And then he went to the World Juniors, put up 14 points in 7 games. And I think Sasha is one of those very intriguing ones where when you look at the raw aspects of his game, you almost have to put it aside because the potential with him is very, very interesting. I describe this as kind of a Sambergy sort of pick, right? A guy that maybe you draft and then sort of don't think about as much for a couple of years. And with Sasha, I think he will require some time and patience. I would probably project him in the 4-year-ish range, maybe a little bit past that, just because I think with him, there's a couple of clear parts of his game that are going to need some work, right? Decision making, the ability to read the game, playing at the speed, and obviously the offense at the college level hasn't quite hit. But again, I think the most important thing to remember is you're talking about the youngest player in the NCAA doing this in his first year. So I think that that's really, really critical to remember when you're evaluating his potential. I think he's actually pretty exciting. Craig Button's very high on him. I'm not like the biggest fan of Button's rankings, but I've seen a lot of very similar things, right? With Bumedian, he can break up plays. He does try to fight for positioning in along the walls and stuff. Tries to use his frame. Not a big guy necessarily, but will try to use his stick to cut down passing and shooting lanes. And does skate very quickly. He's fast, and his main preference is to control that puck, make that first pass out, and try and make clean exits that way, which I think is something that sort of reminds me maybe of Hanela's game as well. But it's a very much a hallmark of like the Dylan Sandbergs. From the footage I saw of him, and look, this is also prospect highlights, so it doesn't show the full shift by shift, but I think that the edge work immediately stands out. The skating stride's not like super, super smooth, but he's very fast, and his acceleration from a standstill was quick, right? So he gets the puck up the ice in transition very quickly. I feel like his activation around the faceoff circles is a little bit underrated. He does seem to time his jumps well. He had a couple of backdoor opportunities, or he was the one setting up a good backdoor feed with a good cross slot pass. And that kind of stuff I like to see. Maybe simple plays, a little bit meat and potatoes. But if you have the presence of mind to know when to slip between defenders and when to jump and drop below the faceoff circles, that's a really underappreciated skill set. And we've really seen Sandberg start to employ the same thing over the past couple of years. So, I got to say, I don't mind this pickle. I think that there were maybe some technically higher ranked prospects that might have been available, but I don't really feel like the Jets missed out. In fact, it almost is a little fascinating that they took another collegiate player who's not the biggest, and it is really a smooth skating guy. It just kind of reminds you that when you look at how the Jets drafting scout the young rookie and prospect scouting team makes their evaluations, they don't really seem to be the same guys that do the pro scouting. We all know that, but I think in terms of like the way that they, each group kind of evaluates defenders and stuff, they prize two very different skill sets and tool sets, which is, it's fascinating. And I just hope that at some point guys like Bumedian do get a chance to play with the Jets. I think Sasha is, again, probably a little further off, but he is one to watch for the future. I like this pick. I think that there's some real upside with it. And down the road, we may be talking about him as a steal, especially with the Jets getting him at the, almost at the end of the first round. You usually don't find a lot of great talent in a draft like this that far back in the first, just because, this is where the guys with cosmetic flaws start to pop up. But especially for this year, that's thought to be a fairly weak draft. Somebody like Bumemedian, who has legitimately great upside and could become a very interesting project player, I think is one to put sort of on the back seat. Don't stress out about his next season too closely. Let him start to get a feel for the game. Check in on him every now and then. I think he could become one of those very intriguing sleepers in Winnipeg's pool. But of course, amidst all of this, the drafting and stuff wasn't the only bit of chaos. Obviously, while the Jets are maybe trying to figure out their own picks, lots of teams have been making moves, some smart, some a little bit questionable. We'll dive into whether or not the folks who believed everything was going to happen in this draft or the folks who believed nothing was going to happen, who ended up being right. We'll chat about that coming right up. Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a ball game with friends or family? Maybe it's game day and you suddenly realize you want to be in the stands. That's exactly where Gametime comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last minute tickets without the stress. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on food, drinks, merch, or even invite a bigger group to come with you. Gametime makes it possible. Gametime also makes buying tickets fast and simple. Prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to first pitch, and they've got incredible last minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. I've used Gametime buying Ravens tickets for playoffs a couple of years ago. I got to see my seat view. I got a best price that you could possibly imagine. And with the World Cup coming up next year, obviously it's going to be a great time. And you can even get last minute tickets and zone deals for savings like 10% off exclusive zone sales on World Cup tickets. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for joining us back again on tonight's show as we were just sort of reflecting on the first round of the draft. Obviously, Winnipeg took a guy that I think a lot of people weren't really anticipating going to the Jets. I heard some people think that he wouldn't be there when Winnipeg made their 28th overall selection. Saw some folks who were kind of like intrigued by it, thinking it was maybe a reach. So there's a lot all over the place with this pick. But, that wasn't really the biggest storyline of the night. Coming into this draft, we heard a lot about how there was going to be tons of movement. The rumors were crazy. And so I thought, honestly, this could be a very intriguing draft year just because, the cap's going up. And I think a lot of teams are recognizing that the ramifications for that are potentially massive. You've got a new CBA that just got approved. The NHL season is expanding. The cap's going up. More and more teams are applying for expansion slots. It's going to be a very interesting period of growth for the league. And also, that means, player salaries and market revenue are going to change a lot, which is going to impact how teams can make their salary structures and contract structures going forward. For a team like Winnipeg, I view it as a very significant challenge for the Jets, especially a smaller market team. Winnipeg doesn't have some of the same advantages that those big other cities and teams have. And so, Winnipeg's going to have to get super creative. But coming into this draft, I thought a lot of teams might be willing to make some big moves and try and make something happen, especially with the sheer amount of stuff moving around. But as it turns out, I would say the first round was relatively modest, I would say, compared to what we thought might happen. We didn't really see anything particularly crazy. The biggest move, of course, was Noah Dobson going to the Montreal Canadiens. In exchange, the Isles received the 16th and 17th overall picks, which, that's pretty solid. I think the thing with these picks is, the Islanders did get some good prospects out of it. But, you'd really hope that if you have those two picks, that at least one of them gets anywhere near as good as Noah Dobson. So I think Montreal actually made a smart bet here. You don't really find top pairing defenders all that often, especially a guy like Noah Dobson, who's already proven, he's 26 years old. He's a big, right-handed shot, great offensive instincts, great defensive value, strong skater. And his contract extension was, a little on the pricey side, but it came in a little bit under 10 mil a season for 8 years. So, this is an interesting one, right? This has the potential to be, a bit of a game changer, but the trade just kind of seemed to come and go. I'm sure for Habs fans, it was an extraordinary moment. And Montreal, I think, is very excited, right? They are rapidly improving. They're making some really big acquisitions. They seem like they are swinging for the fences. But you look at some of these other teams, and not a lot else happened after that. If there's a trade that I do think is probably relevant for the Jets, though, the one to look at is the Charlie Coyle trade. Columbus is up to something, and I don't know what it is, but Coyle is obviously, some big-time Avs depth. And now, Colorado has basically gotten out of some of their salary situations with this trade. And not only was it Coyle, but apparently I think Miles Wood at some point was a part of the deal. Not sure exactly how that all parsed out. But basically, you got Gavin Brindley and some stuff in exchange for Coyle, which, basically bailed the Avs out of a bit of cap, right? I think Coyle's contract was like, what, $5.2 million or something like that. That's a fair bit of money off the books. And, you get Gavin Brindley as a prospect who's pretty dang good. Colorado, it just sort of felt like got bailed out. This is one of those things that I really hate with the Central Division this year, is it just feels like everyone keeps bailing out really good teams in the Central, taking off their stupid cap decisions. And somehow, they pay for it. Like, I don't even know what these teams are up to. I don't know why you would actually give up decent assets for a player like Coyle. Coyle's okay. I wouldn't say that he's a game changer at this point, and it's not like Columbus is really competing either. So why bail out a team for free or even pay to do it? To me, it doesn't really make sense. I will admit I'm self-interested in this one. As a Jets fan, I don't really like seeing Colorado wrangle out of stuff. It does also make me wonder what the Avs are up to. We saw a rumor that they were apparently going to trade for Sidney Crosby, but apparently that was a joke. At least from Crosby's camp, that's what it sounds like. So interesting. I don't know. The rumors this year were particularly crazy. And to be fair, despite not having a ton of stuff happen in this first round, that doesn't mean that the subsequent rounds aren't going to see some interesting movement. Some other teams might be making trades. They might want to have just gone through this first round and waited to see what happens. We did see, Carolina trade down and Chicago move up to make some picks. So yeah, a relatively quiet first round outside of a couple of really obvious moves like the Dobson one. That seems to be the big one. And then everything else sort of kind of fell to the wayside, which makes me wonder what the rest of tomorrow is going to look like. Will we see anything exciting? Will we see some big moves? I think for the Jets, I'm not anticipating anything. We saw all sorts of rumors about maybe guys like Barzal or maybe even Pajot being on the move. But so far, it's been relative radio silence. So keep an eye out for maybe some depth moves. I think where it's quiet and maybe there are some bargain deals to be had, that's probably where the Jets would make their most notable acquisitions. But other than that, I wouldn't anticipate much except contract extensions. July 1st is coming up next week, so that's probably the priority right now, and then maybe some of the trade stuff can happen afterwards. But I will say that for those who doubted anything was going to happen at this draft, you were probably more right than most others. All the insiders kept telling us it was going to be crazy, and all the circumstances and the environment looked really primed for something cool. And then not much really happened, which tends to be the usual NHL MO, right? I will say if there was one thing that was probably noteworthy about this first round, it's just how painful it was to watch. They tried this whole decentralized format, and I can't believe the NHL thought that the way that they executed this was going to go well. It was a glacial pace. It was just super awkward. The way that they did these like so-called celebrity selections was just it really wasn't that great. And like it's not like the normal draft is the world's most exciting thing ever, but at least it doesn't take you 6,000 hours to get through the first round. So yeah, I think this is probably not going to be a format the NHL does again. If anything, it was just, a little overlong, not the most exciting, and yeah, it felt a little bit forced, but you try it as a beta test. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, and you move on. You live and you learn, and you hopefully improve next year. But tomorrow, obviously, the Jets have some intriguing decisions to make. They don't pick for a while, so settle in. Don't worry about the second round unless the Jets make a trade up to get somebody that maybe fell out of the end of the first round. But otherwise, I think at this point, Winnipeg will be looking for those home run kind of swings that they like to make. Maybe there's a Walton somewhere. Maybe there's a Julian type player out there. We'll have to be patient and see what they pull up. When it comes to Winnipeg's like later round drafting, they've really started to pull some really interesting value out of those rounds. So don't write off those picks. Keep an eye out. Maybe one of them becomes an NHLer down the road. But amidst all of this, there was an interesting rumor that the Jets have been a part of, and the market continues to make some moves here and there with some other teams making some signings. This stuff will probably impact the Jets as well. And if the rumor about who they're interested in is also to be believed, Winnipeg is also trying to add to their own roster depth and make this team a little deeper heading into next season. We'll talk about that coming right up. Ever wish managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can be. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than just a budgeting app, though. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. If you're thinking about how much you're spending on subscriptions, ordering out, all this stuff. Monarch Money can help you centralize and track all of these different expenses and help you figure out what you need to cut and what you should keep if you're serious about managing your finances and continuing to build your wealth. It's a great option. You can even set goals, and there are even shared accounts if you've got a partner or spouse, so you'll always be on the same page. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNHL for half off your first year. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us at tonight's show as we are just chatting a little bit about the trade mill, the contract mill. Obviously, it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks for a lot of teams, including Winnipeg. The Ehlers thing is kind of hanging over our heads, but I think we all have sort of, to some degree, bid our farewells to Nick. All right, so that's probably happening. Unless there's a late development where Ehlers can't find another landing spot, it just seems like Carolina's probably in pole position to make that signing. So the Jets are trying to figure out what to do from there. Obviously Winnipeg is in a bit of a tight spot in some ways. There's not a lot of wing talent that I think could come in and do the same sorts of things that Ehlers is likely to bring to his new team. And with that in mind, the Jets were apparently in on Jean-Gabriel Pageau. Now, Pageau, I've sort of talked about in years past. He's a solid middle six option, right? Very decent, underrated 2C sort of player, even though you might ideally like him in your 3C role. Given the Jets' center depth, though, I would think, a 2C spot is probably his best option, given the fact that we heard, the Lowry surgery might have been a little more significant than I thought it was. The injury that he apparently had surgery for on his hips is something that's been bothering him for a few years. So that was a rather alarming tidbit that kind of dropped out of nowhere. I didn't really even see it until I saw Murat from The Athletic post about it, and I was like 8 hours behind on the tweet. But when I saw that, I felt like not enough attention was being paid to it. So the need for a center is actually rather urgent. Pageau could be a really interesting budget choice. I don't think he would be my first choice, but if the Jets make a cheap trade for him, I don't hate it, right? I think Pageau would be a pretty solid two-way skater. He can do some special teams work, and he's a fairly crafty center, also can play out wide. Doesn't have the crazy explosiveness and speed that he used to, but I think given, his role with this Jets team and what Winnipeg would really be asking of him, which is to provide kind of like that secondary, they have like the 2A, 2B sort of line deployments. If he's coming in to do that kind of thing behind that top line, I think that's a perfect role. And if the price is not exorbitant, I think I would be very okay with that. Again, not the first option that I would go with if you're trying to really improve the center depth, but we also know that Winnipeg's probably not swinging for the fences on a gigantic ceiling-raising trade and acquisition, which is disappointing, not super shocking. I think we know that the Jets are kind of sometimes stuck in their ways. It is what it is. I really do feel like they really should be going after the ceiling raisers, but Pageau at least does raise your floor. And if that's what he can do for this team, that's fine. I do wish, again, that Winnipeg might swing a little bit bigger, and it's not like we've heard that they aren't completely. It's just so far, that's what it looks like they're up to. Doesn't seem that they are going for anyone crazy, but that could absolutely change over the next 72 hours or so. As we get closer and closer to July 1st, a lot of teams are still settling their RFA deals. Winnipeg itself has not announced any of its contract extensions from some of their biggest RFAs right now, or the Kyle Connor extension. All of that has to be in progress, you'd think, unless there's a really big surprise somewhere. But I think we're all expecting Sandberg, Connor, and Velarde to come back. So it's just a question of how much and for how long. Very intrigued by all of it. But for the Jets, I think, if they do kind of go in this middle tier of player, Mangiapane, Pageau, and Taves filling out your top nine, it's not the worst. Taves, I do have like my own reservations about Taves. I just don't think he's really going to play particularly well at this level. Maybe he's got a big surprise in store, but it's really hard to get a sense of what he's going to do, especially with so much time off. And so for that reason, I'm not really thinking about him so much. I'm a lot more interested in projecting, Pajot, Mangiapane, these kinds of guys, because they actually have something to go off of recently. So that's what I'll focus on probably going forward. Hopefully, we get some announcements of rumors, trades, or even signing rumors for the Jets. Still radio silence so far. Still radio silence so far. Pajot's the last we've heard, aside from Mangiapane. So I will say, I like those particular kinds of rumors. I feel like those are the sorts of guys that the Jets can get on the cheap, but they do help add some additional finishing talent and two-way play to a team that right now is certainly lacking that. I just think it's not yet enough to replace, losing a big matchup guy like Ehlers, and especially a guy who on the power play was a bit of a wizard this year. So lots of work for the Jets to do. It's going to be a very interesting run up to July 1st. I would expect, this is going to be one of the tougher couple of weeks for Jets fans as we say goodbye to some of our longest tenured players, some guys we've, grown up watching for the past couple of years. We've seen them go from babies to full-time Jets. And, breakups are inevitable in this business, but it is never easy to see one of the, I would say, cult fan favorites hitting the highway. I'm sure everyone wants to see Mason Appleton go. I do feel for Mason, that moment with the Star Series, I'm sure is going to live in some infamy. Hopefully on his next team, he feels happier and is able to sort of rehab some of that image because, I don't think that he was as bad as people say he was. I think he was just a fourth liner that got overplayed. And at least in the meantime, he'll probably get paid like a middle six guy. So get that bag, go chase it, King. And I think everyone will support that. But curious to know how you're feeling about this draft so far. Are you excited for what the Jets could do going forward, or are you nervous about what decisions they might make next? Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's all the time that we have. Thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here next week, so have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.